When Germany surrendered in 1945, most of us assumed the European front of the Second World War was over, but to others, this was just a momentary calm before a greater storm, a victory of the battle, but not the war. The old order of the West, the United States, Britain, and France, had toppled the new threat fascism posed to their hegemony and ways of life, but there existed a rival ideology of the new order, and that was communism. The Soviet Union, a beast which, if not slain, could very well charge through Europe and raise its flag over the world. Winston Churchill believed as much, as did US General Patton and even leader of Free France Charles de Gaulle. Stalin had occupied the vast mass of Central and Eastern Europe and installed puppet regimes obedient to the USSR, leaving Poland, the nation whose invasion sparked the Second World War, still under enemy occupation. So what could be done to resolve this? The answer was Operation Unthinkable, a plan ordered by Winston Churchill to lay out a strategy to, quote, impose upon Russia the will of the US and Britain, essentially to repel the Soviets from Poland and Germany at the very least. The plan relied upon a number of factors, including total Polish support, the rearming of the German military, the exclusion of Soviet naval and air forces, as well as American involvement. The US was not overly enthused with the prospect of exhausting further resources in Europe, nor did many believe it was realistic for the plan to work, considering the massive Soviet land army, the majority of which had been stationed along the German front, and would form a near unshatterable shield into Soviet land. Britain would coerce the US to support the effort, however, as by this point in time the Soviets had yet to launch their offensive against Japan, leading some within Britain and the US to speculate that the USSR would betray its allies and align with the Japanese Empire against the West. So there's the how, but if the invasion were to be launched, the US and Britain would have but the advantage of surprise on their hands. That and perhaps another surprise, the atomic bomb. Yet to be used on Japan, the capabilities of this weapon were more or less a secret to the rest of the world, and there is a possibility for it to be allocated to Europe should the Soviets become a threat. So let's suppose that in this timeline, despite the risks, Britain and the US agreed that for the safety of Europe and to end the war for good, they would invade Soviet-occupied lands on July 1st of 1945, attempting to muster a victory before the onset of winter. Number to number, we're looking at a Western manpower at best of some 6.5 million, and a Soviet manpower of 7 million, with another 4 million or so scattered throughout Soviet territory. The Western powers have far more tanks and guns, but were working with comparably inferior quality than those of the Soviets. Artillery was also in the Soviets' favor, however the superiority of the Western Air Force might be a fair leveler against Soviet artillery. The way this breaks down, numbers don't seem to be in the Allies' favor, but good tactics and the element of surprise might be enough to catch the Soviets off guard. But isn't that what everyone who has invaded Russia thinks? Contrary to what you might assume, the Soviets would actually have the greater advantage in the first few days, with the bulk of their military already deployed to the front lines. They'd be able to crush Allied advances before they came too far, perhaps best comparable to Germany's march through Belgium in World War I, making great headway until it came to a lock in northern France. The same would be true for the Allies as they broke the border of Soviet-occupied Poland. Luckily for the West, the Soviets' advantage would dry up with time, as resource reserves which were initially coming from the US and other Allied powers are cut off, forcing it to siphon resources from its occupied lands, and as resources are depleted, the same could be said for soldiers, the Soviets having depleted their entire reserves into the full standing army, while the UK and US did have emergency manpower to draw upon if necessary. Essentially, if the Soviet wall could be breached, there'd be little to no resistance on their home front. This cave in the Soviet barrier gives Allies enough momentum to push further on. Britain requests more support from America, however the US finds its forces split between the invasion of Japan and the USSR, having been advised to withhold on the use of the A-bomb so it could be used as a last resort against the Soviets. Thus, Britain draws upon reserve soldiers from colonies whose skills were below that of the veterans who'd been fighting the war for the last 5 years now, but whose great numbers helped balance out the tides of battle. US troops are authorized by the American government to march as far as the eastern Polish border, but move no further than that, so that resources and manpower could be routed into Operation Downfall in Japan. Britain requests transfer of the Little Boy atomic bomb to them for deployment over Leningrad or Moscow. Soviet Army Commander Georgy Zhukov relates to Stalin a plan to encircle the Allies by invading West Germany in an upward push through Czechoslovakia, cutting British soldiers off from supply shipments. Stalin approves the order, calling for soldiers to hold their ground as he reinforced numbers along the Polish border to distract British troops as Zhukov launched his invasion, overwhelming the Allies and marching half his army toward East Germany, while the other half pushed into Belgium and onward into France, asserting to Britain that their war of aggression was over, and soon the British mainland would face the unrelenting fury of the Soviet army. Stalin prepares to transport artillery and rockets to newly occupied France for an overseas assault on the British coast. Churchill would reach out to Stalin and request the peaceful relinquishment of all occupied European land or face total war. Stalin recognizes that Britain was on the losing end and would not settle for this insulting proposition, for as depleted as the Soviet war machine's fuel was, it remained in full motion and had the momentum to annihilate Britain. As Stalin's messages relate to Churchill, the decision is made. On August 6th, the US and Britain would simultaneously deploy their atomic weapons, crossing deep into enemy lines by plane, assured to drop the two most powerful bombs the world had ever seen upon the cities of Nagasaki and Leningrad. Soviet forces who experienced the impact from a safe enough distance were in a state of shock and awe. In an instant, the USSR's second largest city had been obliterated. Churchill relayed to Stalin one final call for peace at risk of unrestricted nuclear bombardment, despite the Allied arsenal possessing no more A-bombs at the time, and only being able to produce a third as soon as August 17th, over 10 days later, and that wouldn't be factoring in the time required to deploy this third bomb. In this period of shock and confusion, both the Soviet Union and Japanese Empire would ponder their choices: continue the war and lose more cities, or unconditional surrender. Japan, not being weighed upon by two bombings nor the Soviet Union's declaration of war, would continue to fight onward, refusing to surrender. Stalin was on a time limit but observed Japan for as long as he could, and concluded that the Allies had no more bombs. He thus proceeded to crush Anglo-American forces in Poland and East Germany. During this time, the US would construct 3 more bombs, but Britain, having lost their foothold on mainland Europe, was far out of range of Soviet cities. There was but one logical target: the concentrated Soviet army in East Germany. Some 5 million men, though there'd be hesitation from Churchill, as British and American men would likely be caught in the blast, not to mention the German civilians. It'd weigh on him even more than Hiroshima and Nagasaki did on Truman, but if he failed to act, those lives and countless others might be lost regardless. It is with a heavy heart on August 20th that Churchill signs off on the use of an atomic bomb in the northern border of Germany and Poland, wiping out millions of Soviet forces in the region, and allowing British soldiers to regroup and seize the land back, transporting a second bomb through Norway for deployment over Moscow. The US would use its remaining nuke on the Japanese city of Kokura. On August 26th, commands from Moscow would cease. The Soviet government had been eradicated, and yet another Japanese city had been wiped off the map. Realizing how close the US was coming to striking their capital, Emperor Hirohito would call for surrender. In Europe, Stalin was gone, as were his second-in-commands and much of his succession line. Georgy Zhukov was stationed in Poland when the nuke went off, and hasn't been heard from since, as well as many other Soviet generals. Only Nikita Khrushchev, who'd been in the Ukraine to clear it of German sympathizers, had survived. And just as in our timeline, Khrushchev, with his connections to prominent Soviet governing bodies and status as a high-ranking commissar, would assume the rank of leader of the Soviet Union, asserting his claim to the title over a number of contenders. Peace would be made between Khrushchev's USSR and Britain, who would initiate a period of reconstruction and de-Stalinization in the USSR through Anglo-American occupation. Similar work would begin in Japan to demilitarize the nation and pacify it. Communist cells within occupied Russia would wage a guerrilla war against Anglo-American occupiers, while others fled into China, Southern Europe, the Middle East, and into Canada. And that is where I'll end this video for now. The US of Z thanks you for watching. Support your Legion by liking the video, or join our ranks by subscribing for more. Mr. Z, out.